Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to the channel. My name's Jared. Today I'm going to start working on the 180 to get it ready for the roadworthy. I was driving it and it does make a clunking noise in the back. This is the 89, so that means that the diff bushings don't exist. It's solid mounted. And I had a look underneath and the subframe definitely looks like it's moving around a bit. I'm not sure if this is right, but I can fit my whole finger between the subframe and the bush. And you can see these witness marks where the bush has been pushing into the chassis. And here you can see this diff is solid mounted there. And these early ones don't have any bushing in there too. And overall this thing's just crusty because now it's 35 years old. You can see I've already got some camber arms and coilovers in here. But we really need to refresh everything else. There's even some cracking in the side of the bushing here. So that's where all of this stuff comes in. So to start off, I purchased this energy suspension kit off Rock Auto, and it came with all these bushes and these steel pins to press in and some grease. And this is supposed to do the whole rear end arms. So I think these ones are to go in the knuckles and these must be for some of the arms on the back. But I also bought these adjustable toe arms for the rear so I can dial in the suspension, and also some traction arms. They actually came in a kit, the two together. I was thinking about not using the traction arms, but I think I will just put them in and lengthen them a little bit to help with some more traction. These ones are eBay, but they come with the rubber bush, and I've used these before and I've had pretty good success. They haven't broken as long as you adjust them correctly. Following on from that, at the same time I went ahead and I got some lower ball joints because they're probably still the original ones in the back, and also some subframe bushes from GK Tech, and these ones are also roll center adjustable, and you get 4 of them. So to remove the subframe, it's a bit of a job. It's probably not one for the novice. You're gonna have to remove the wheels and take the calipers off, and also remove the coilover. Then we'll need to remove the exhaust and the drive shaft connecting to the diff, and then we'll be able to take the whole subframe down in one piece. Next we need to remove the caliper. So you have one bolt at the top and the bottom, and that should pull off the side just because that brake line is connected to the chassis, and so is that parking cable that's also here. Next we're going to remove the lower bolt off the coilover, just because the coilover is attached to the body, and that'll allow that subframe or this arm here to move between all of these mounting points, and we can drop it down. First we're starting off here by removing the nut that holds on the lower bolt for the coilover. Then you can go ahead and just push this out of the way with a bit of force, and we can move on to undoing the flange holding the exhaust under the diff. I ended up removing the center section as well, as it was still in the way. Then I moved on to removing the 12mm nuts holding the drive shaft onto the diff. Then you can lever this off, it might be a bit stuck. Then you can go ahead and remove the exhaust from the hangers. This tool makes it really easy and simple to do that. One thing you can remove now which save you later is actually these 2 bolts holding the handbrake in, and if you follow that over, there's actually another bolt on the top holding this. You can lower the subframe with it still attached, but you may risk damaging it, and you'll need to remove it anyway to take the subframe out. Next we can move on to removing the bolts holding the subframe in. There's these 2 L-shaped brackets at the front of the subframe which have 3 bolts holding them in, and this small little bracket you can see me holding on the side with 12mm. Once you take these off, you want to go and thread the nut back on to ensure the subframe doesn't drop out.
Then on the back you've just got these two cone shaped washers. You can see these were very tight. I couldn't undo them with the impact and I required the breaker bar to loosen them up. Then I could go ahead with the impact and remove them. The diff's very heavy in the subframe, so now you want to go ahead and put a jack under the diff. As you can see, it's starting to take the last one out, the subframe's falling down, and you want to have that diff under there to catch it, and make sure that the calipers don't get caught up here.
Only one out of all the bushes, and this one is still torn, is intact. That one pulled through. This one is hanging on for dear life, and that one is non-existent as well. As you can see, it's still on here. And that one's still on there as well.
Next I'm going to work on removing all of these arms, because obviously we're replacing the tow arm and also the traction arm. We're going to keep these camber arms, which I have already, and remove the lower control arm for the bushes, and then I'll see whether I'm going to remove the drive shafts and the diff, or whether we're just going to clean it up all together.
Now we're going to move on to the dismantling of the subframe. Here I'm just starting by removing the bolts holding the traction arm, then moving on to the camber arm. After that, then I'm moving on to the tow arm and trying to get some of the bolts on the lower control arm. Then I'm just removing the split pin that's holding in the nut for the axle. And I should have loosened these when it was still on the car, as I couldn't undo it here with the bar. So then I decided to move on to removing the nuts holding the axle to the diff. If you have adjustable arms, I suggest you label them which side is which so you can install them back on the same side. Then I'm removing the end links for the sway bar. These were seized on, quite hard to remove. Then I'm going ahead and flipping the subframe over, as I couldn't get some of the lower control arm bolts when it was laying down. Then I'm going ahead just levering the thing out and removing the knuckle with the drive shaft axle as one piece for now. Now we can move on to the diff. It's got 4 nuts holding it onto the back of the subframe. This is where Nissan used to make things strong before they went to the single bolt on the 350 and G35s. Then you can go ahead and remove 2 bolts at the front and pull that diff out. Now we're going to remove the lower control arm from the spindle. So you just got to remove a split pin and the nut holding the ball joint on. Then I'm just putting a ball joint separator on. And once you get everything apart, just take it outside and pressure washer off the dirt. And then I'm just putting some degreaser on them and just agitating it with a brush before I'm going and hitting it with the pressure washer again.
So now we got all this cleaned up, we're going to move on to removing these bushes. So as you saw before, some of mine just fell out, but essentially we need to get it to this stage like this so we can go remove the outer shell or clean up the rubber that's remaining inside. There's 2 ways you can remove this. One, if yours is pretty worn like mine, you may be able to just hit it with a hammer and knock it out, or alternatively we can use a hole saw. So this one I'm going to show you with a hole saw how to do it. and the other one we can probably do with a hammer, just so you can see the difference between it. So you want to get yourself a hole saw which fits just perfectly inside of that bush. You're not going to be drilling this outer race, we're just going to remove this inner part from the bush.
When using the hole saw, you're probably only going to get halfway through one side before you'll need to flip it over to the other, as there's quite a bit of friction on the outside of the hole saw.
One here, I'm going to see whether I can just remove it by hitting it with a hammer. So next what we have to do with these bushes is remove actually the outer race. So it's very hard to press these out, but what we're going to do is actually put a cut through the side here and chisel out the bushing race so it can be removed. Just be careful, some of the kits require you to keep the outside race in. So what you're going to have to do is then remove the rubber which is still remaining in here. And what you can do is use a wire brush on a drill to get that out. But in this case, we're going to remove it all together. And the best tool to use for this is actually the reciprocating saw, or you can use a hand saw. But essentially what we're going to do is use the saw to cut through a slit and a hammer and a chisel to then punch it back out. See here the cut which has gone into the race. You don't want to go any further than the actual subframe here. This metal bit here is the subframe, so just in the middle is where we're going to cut. What I found with the last few was I was able to remove it just with a punch and hammer. As you can see here, the punch has just gone along the side of the bush and it's come out. So I've just used this tapered chisel here, and what you need to do is just get it started between the outer race and the subframe, and then once it's in there you can just keep driving it down until it pops out the bottom. But you need to make sure you do it from the bottom side and not the top side, because the top side has the lip, so you need to go out through the bottom. And I've just did the other three in about 10 minutes. And as you can see here with the new bushes, they're not going to go in too easy. So we're going to have to use a wire wheel and just clean up on that inner race before we can go ahead and reinstall it. Especially if we made any sort of gouges where that chisel may have ran through, because it's going to make it more difficult to get it started. So before we paint the subframe, which I got set up here, I've just gone through and there was some rust on a few spots. So I've just sprayed it with a rust converter so that when we put the paint on it doesn't continue to rust underneath. So that's just drying now. Next we're going to move on to these lower control arms, because this is the only arm which we're going to be keeping, and we're going to need to press out the ball joint as well as these bushings. After that I'm going to weld in a piece on the bottom here just to reinforce the mounting point of the lower control arm. On the Nismo lower control arms they do come already boxed in here, so I'm just going to copy that. And we got our bushes here which we're going to press into thereafter. And for the lower ball joint I've just gone with the GK Tech one because it was the most cost effective. If you plan to drift or track your car, I recommend you go ahead and buy the weld-in subframe reinforcement kit from GK Tech, which covers this diff mounting part, because often these mounts get torn out from doing a lot of clutch kicks and from using grippy tires. They also box in these sections where the arms mount to the subframe so you don't tear any mounting tabs off the subframe as well. So to press out these lower ball joints, we're going to need to go ahead and remove the circlip which holds in the ball joint so it doesn't fall out.
When we press out the bush, we need to support it under this bottom part of the arm. We don't want to support it on the sides here, because this steel will deflect or bend when we go to push any force on it. Seeming as though we're not going to use this ball joint again, you can just press on top of this ball joint to press it out.
Just finished removing with the bushes on one of the arms as a trial before I show you, but I did try to use the press. I couldn't get the arm close enough, so I ended up putting a notch in the press to try and get it close enough, but all I had was this socket and a 24mm socket to press it, and the arm would just keep going on the side. Then I started to try and use this press tool, but it was the same story, it just wouldn't go straight, and as you can see, they were kind of rusted in there a bit as well. So I ended up doing the other method, and I drilled out the center, cut a slot in it and chiseled it out, which I'll show you now. With removing the bushes on the knuckle, this one here and this one here, you are able to remove on the press. It is a little difficult, but I used a 30mm socket and a 22mm socket on top to press it through and receive it. This last bush here is very difficult to remove because of its proximity to this mounting point here. You can't actually fit it in the press or fit anything behind it, and this tool here also does not work. Our other method of using the hole saw doesn't work because there's not enough actual rubber around here. So what I ended up doing was I used this puller and I just pushed the center of the bush out, and it looks something like this once it's pressed out. And then I used the other method with the hacksaw to cut it and push out the out of shell like this. So I've just cut these small pieces of metal which are going to go in here just to reinforce that ball end of it. Now we can move on to installing the bushes into the lower control arms. In this kit, the bushes are the larger of the two. Here you can see a smaller one. This one's got the thicker wall on it, and it's got a smaller inner bush diameter as well. So these are the two large ones we're going to install. Also, you can see here we got a tall and a short bush, and this one's thicker than that one. So the short ones are the ones we're going to be using. It does come with grease, but it is very sticky. I ended up just using my own Molly grease for this because it was easier to clean up. The sticky stuff was really hard to wipe off. I also went and got this bolt and these two washers, because what we're essentially going to do is use the bolt to pull it into the lower control arm. So essentially we're just going to grease up the front edge of the bush, the tapered section, and a little bit on the shank as well. And then we're going to put some grease inside where we're going to push it.
Then you're going to get your bolt with the washer put on the bush, into the arm with the washer on the other side, and the nut. As I installed these bushes in the knuckle, you can see that the bush just creased and it didn't go in very straight. So I ended up using these multi-grips just to push the corner back in. And once it was back in, then it was easy to pull through the rest of the way. Pushing these ones in by hand was impossible, so I ended up just using the vise to pull them in, which was quite easy. Next we're going to move on to installing the subframe bushes. As you saw, we previously removed. This is what the bushes look like. They come in two halves here, one with a thinner lip and one with a thicker lip. So depending on how you put this around is going to depend on the roll center correction. So if you place it with the thicker side on the top, it's going to be OEM specs and going to give you a bit more ground clearance, whereas if you flip it around and put the skinnier one to the top, it's actually going to give you 10mm extra roll center correction. These bushes were quite difficult to install. You can see I started with the rubber mallet and then transitioned to the 4-pound hammer just because I needed that extra force to be able to push it in. I did try with the nut and bolt method as we tried on the lower control arms, but it just required too much force and ended up just pulling the bush through in itself. Then I bought some wheel bearings and decided to press them in and did a very bad job at filming this part. As you can see here, this is the inner race of the wheel bearing that's normally sitting in there like that, and in order to remove it, as you can see there, I've just had to cut it because I didn't have a bearing puller the right size. Just be careful not to damage the shaft too much and fix up any damage before you press the new bearing back on. As you can see here under the subframe, there are two lines here. This one with the hose clamp is the pressure or the feed line for the fuel system, and the other one next to it is the return line from the fuel rail, and the last hose you can see over here is just a vent from the charcoal canister back into the tank. Most likely you guys have your charcoal canister removed, so that line there is kind of for nothing. So what I would suggest is these lines here, now my car is 35 years old, so I'm gonna go ahead and remove it and replace it now with some E85 line. And if you do intend on keeping the car for a while and possibly going E85, now is the time to put the line in, because it is much harder to replace that hose with the subframe in later.
So this is just a 5/16. Make sure it says E85 compatible fuel line, which I'm just going to replace those sections with. I got a bit extra because most likely we're going to be doing the engine bay later on as well.
When removing these lines, it's best to do one at a time, as it's pretty easy to mix up which one is the feed and the return. And I found pulling them out of the bracket here was the easiest option to be able to pull the line out. On the top here you got 4 10mm bolts holding down the cover and 2 Phillips head screws on the cover for the connector to protect it. Then you can go ahead and pull that up and you can see the 2 fuel lines here. I've previously been in here to change the pump, that's why there's new clamps on the hoses, and you want to go ahead and just push them off. I just pushed one hose at a time like I mentioned before to change one so I don't mix them up at the bottom and the top. You might find it easier if you bend up the metal a little bit so you can fit your fingers in there to pull on the hose, and you want to go ahead and push that back down later so you can put the cover on. You can use some long nose needle pliers here to pull the line on if you can't grab it. Just make sure you don't damage the hose. Then you can go ahead and throw everything back together as it was.
Alright, so next we're up to putting the subframe back into the car. And one thing that we need to decide now, or you need to decide now, is the plan with these washers. So they supply these washers with the kit, but there is a note here that use either the supplied washer, this one, or the stamped washer. As you can see here, that's that part there. So you have to choose. Over here it mentions use either the supplied washer or the OEM stamped bracket, this angled one, which is this looking one here. Do not use both together. The OEM bracket adds more rigidity and is recommended to use. So I guess if you have the bracket from your car, it seems like that is the way to go. But if you don't have the bracket, then you can go ahead and use these. And they go like that. Or the other one sits like this. It's just a bit weird because the old one used to sit inside of the bush. Now this one sits on top. But I assume that if you have that one and that one on, the thread engagement is going to be slightly too short. So to get it in by yourself, as you can see, I've got a piece of timber spanning the front and the back of the subframe, and the jack pushing on that bit of timber. You need to make sure that it avoids sticking out and hitting the fuel tank. And then from there you can jack it up and get it onto the studs. I ran out of jacking height and had to add an extra bit of timber under there for the extra height. As you can see now, we have the studs out and the subframe is against the car here as well. Now we're ready to put on our pressed steel brackets. Before you do up these bolts all the way, I suggest that you get these handbrake brackets on the subframe, because before you raise it, it's going to reduce the amount of clearance you have here to actually get that nut, to get that bolt on. So you want to get that on first, and it's going to make it even more difficult because we've raised the height of the subframe to correct the roll center, and it'll give you less clearance there. Next you want to go throw in the diff. What I recommend is that you actually put the diff through the back first on an angle. So it's going to be pointing up towards the subframe, and then you're going to put the bottom 2 in, followed by the top 2. Then you can shimmy the jack forward, and then you can work on getting these front 2 bolts in after that. But make sure this isn't too tight when you're trying to do the front bolts, as you're going to need a bit of wiggle room to get them lined up.
First I'm starting with installing the lower control arm by putting those 2 bolts in. Then I went ahead to put the knuckle on the lower ball joint. Then next I went to put in the hub to receive the axle in the next step, which had 4 bolts to hold the back of that in. Don't forget the heat shield, put it on the right side. Then, like I said, we can put the axle in because we have a bit more room now to move the hub around. Then I went ahead to put the upper camber arm on and the washer and the nut for the axle.
Now we're on to installing the new toe arms as well as the new traction arms. What I suggest is most likely before you had your wheel alignment with the factory arm still in. With the aftermarket arm, I suggest that you set it to match the same length as a starting point. With the traction arm, this one's a little bit harder to set. Often you'll find most alignment shops don't even touch this one and they just touch the toe and the camber arm. So what we're gonna do before we install it is we're actually gonna set it, which is going to be longer than the factory arm. So when you set the length of the arm, what I like to do is start with both ends wound all the way in so they're at the same starting point. What I've seen a lot of other people do is adjust them individually, and what you'll find is if you wind one out one side more than the other, it's going to be weaker as there's more leverage on the thread, which is not as thick as the center section. So what you want to do is I just hold one end in the vise and the other one by hand. You want to turn it by the middle buckle and then line it up with the factory arm. So what you can see I've done here is I put the bolt through both ends and then I stack these on top of each other. And then you want to adjust it so when you look through the hole, they're both lined up with the bolt in the top there. And now they're set to the same length, ready to go into the car. With these rear bolts for the camber arm, I would suggest removing them. You can keep them, but that extra weight on there is going to not improve the performance anyhow. I happen to have some of these bolts, which are what you see on the toe arm. I had a few spare ones. You can also buy an eccentric lockout kit which replaces this nut and washer, because as you can see the bolt hole is offset here and it's like a cam lobe on it. It just replaces it so under high load this doesn't actually shift, because what can happen is you get an alignment and you go around a corner really hard on sticky tires, this can rotate or change your camber or toe setting. But in this case I don't have very big meaty tires, it's just a street car. I'm going to use these bolts, but I'm going to replace this big heavy one just with a standard one like that. So with the traction arm, if we measure it center to center, the factory one is 21 centimeters or 8¼ inches. So they recommend online that you lengthen these to correct the toe curve when you lower the vehicle. So I've seen people mentioning anywhere from lengthening it from 10 mil up to 1 inch, and the lower your car is, the longer you're going to want to make the arm. So if you have a very low car, you probably want to lengthen it by 1 inch. If your car is lowered but not too low, maybe you could go 1/2 inch, or if it's just slightly lowered by maybe 1 inch or so, you might only want to go 10 mil. So for my car, I would say it's probably somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to go 1/2 inch, which is about 12.5, 13 mil longer. So again, we're just going to start with that all the way in. So I'm looking for 22.2 to the whole center. Yeah, that's funny. The aftermarket arm, even in its shortest position, is still longer than the factory toe arm. So you couldn't buy this to replace your factory toe arm. So it looks like even on the shortest position, we're pretty much at our lengthened goal. Just maybe exactly what we're after. I'm at 22.3. Ooh. So that's lengthened at 13 mil. So we've gone from 21 to 22.3. Then we're going to set the other one the same. So it looks like the arm is hitting on the top here, so we're going to have to clearance it just slightly. It's just hitting on the top of this arm here, and I guess that's eBay quality for you. Alright guys, that wraps up the video. I know it was a very long video, but I didn't want to split this into two parts because it might be boring. But yeah, this is a lot of work. Don't expect to probably get all of this done in one weekend, unless you've got some buddies to help you. But yeah, pushing out those bushes and the bearings and all of that, it takes way longer than you think, especially when you got a little press like one of these. It barely did the job. I did have to modify it. I ended up having to flip these plates around and use these bolts to get it a bit wider to be able to press the bearing hubs. And you can see in the process I did bend one side, and I even cut a notch out of it in order to get the lower control arm in to press the bushes out. But it is possible with one of those little 6-ton presses to get everything out. Otherwise, yeah, you're going to need one of those reciprocating saws to cut those bearing shells out to get them in. To pull them in took longer than I thought as well, to line up the bolt and get it pulled in a square. But if you guys have a 35-year-old S chassis now, you need to do those subframe bushes. And if you have a diff bush as well, you need to do the diff bushes. They're just falling apart. The rubber is just not like it is brand new. So it's 100% a must-do mod for any of you young players out there. And if you don't have time just yet to do it, you can buy these subframe collars which insert into the subframe, and they can buy you a little bit more time. It is worth noting with these subframe bushes that when you do drive, it's going to increase the noise that you hear through the transmission and through the road that goes into the body, because that subframe is mounted to the body of the car. All of that noise and vibration is going to be transferred inside, so you're definitely going to hear it and hear your diff as well. So don't freak out, that is totally normal. And the subframe bushes from GK Tech, I found that they were probably a little bit too much on the tight side. It is possible to get them in, but I felt like they were slightly too big. The bushes from Energy Suspension for the arms, they were all fine. I didn't have any problems with them. They installed fine and they were the right size. And those wheel hub bearings, I just got them off eBay. A pair of them was $90. If you had a bit more time, I would recommend pulling the diff down and rebuilding that. If you had more money, you could also buy new axles or drive shafts and put them in, or you can take the boots off and rebuild them. I just didn't have the time or the money at this stage to do it, and they were still in good condition. And finally, since we've changed everything with the alignment, the roll centers, all the adjustable arms and bushes, you 101% need to go get a wheel alignment done now to correct the geometry, because your car will not drive straight. If this video was helpful, give it a thumbs up, hang around, and in the next episode you'll see that we didn't put the sway bar in. I've got some sway bars which we're going to install on the front and rear of this car. Cheers, thanks for watching.